In Chapter 1, Section 5, we're taking a look at the essential question: how have the demographics of the United States changed, and what are the potential impacts of that change? We're talking about demographics, we're talking about characteristics regarding people. The American colonies were, relative to today, small and homogeneous, meaning that they were very similar in terms of the demographic composition of the people. In other words, they were English speaking, they were Christian Protestants, they were, and only white males essentially were voting, most of them being landowning males. The Constitution, however, required each member of the House of Representatives should represent about 30,000 people. But what we see in the early part of our nation is a rapid population growth that just continues and continues and continues. So that number was often higher. As the nation grows westward, hundreds of thousands of new immigrants come to the United States, often in waves, kind of what we just talked about. And despite that growth in population, the geographic size hasn't changed in many, many years. 1959 was were the last two states admitted to the Union, Hawaii and Alaska. But the population has grown to over 300 million. It's actually over 350 million today. Each member of the House now represents hundreds of thousands of people. Racial and ethnic composition. The American population has been altered constantly throughout its history by new immigrants. Western Europeans fleeing religious persecution in the 1600s and early 1700s. Slaves from Africa brought here against their will in the late 1700s. Chinese laborers for the railroads in the gold rush in 1848. Irish Catholics during the potato famine in the 1850s, and then again a few decades later. Northern and Eastern Europeans from 1880s to 1910. This was the peak era of immigration. The next peak wouldn't come until 1980, where roughly 4 million people were admitted in that year. Today, nearly 40 million people in the U.S. are considered immigrants. Most of those immigrants are Hispanic. Recently, South and Southeast Asians, Cubans, and Mexicans have made up a huge chunk of the immigrant population. Many Hispanics have resisted American cultural assimilation, according to your book. The language in particular has been a difficult issue. The abundance of Spanish-speaking people in certain sections of the country has also caused governments to alter the way that they do business. So you often have options between English and Spanish on forms and in other things related to the government. So the debate has become: should Americans speak English, or should the United States become a bilingual nation, sort of like Canada, with English and French? Obviously, the two sides of the political spectrum are the ones debating that issue. Immigration has led to changes in America's racial and ethnic composition, with Hispanics becoming the second most common racial or ethnic group. 40% of those people are under 25. 40% of those under 25 are members of minority groups, which is a huge change. And the white population, despite that, is still overrepresented in Congress, particularly when your book was written. And we can expect that to change. In fact, we have begun to see change. Aging. Because of changes in patterns of fertility, life expectancy, and immigration, the nation's age profile has changed dramatically. Just as an example of the life expectancy factor, in 1776, the life expectancy was 35 years. In 2010, for women, it was 81 years, and for men, it was 76 years. This aging population means an increased cost for the government. So, for instance, the baby boomers, the generation of people who were born after World War II, some 76.8 million people have reached the age of Social Security Medicare. So what this could do, potentially, is pit the interest of the young against those of the elderly. should there be cuts to benefits, or should there be an increased taxes on workers? In other words, cuts to benefits would hypothetically, in the short term, benefit people who are young and still working, and increased taxes on workers to help maintain the benefits for the elderly would negatively impact, hypothetically, the young. The young might also want schools and parks, while the elderly might prioritize Medicare prescription plans, and they often have different and conflicting voting priorities. Religious beliefs. Virtually all of the first settlers identified as some sect of Christianity, and the religion permeated both the social and political systems. There are now in America a number of different religious groups who make demands on government. Their particular interests, for instance, Jewish people and Israel in the Middle East, evangelicals, moral values in the classroom, make it difficult to meet the founder's secular goal, that idea of separation of church and state. Rapid growth and expansion. Regional sectionalism has emerged almost immediately upon the country's founding, with the South favoring commerce, while the religious interests populated many of the northern settlements. Those secular differences continued to evolve as immigration communities settled with their cultural values into similar area. For instance, Scandinavians into Minnesota, the Irish and Italians, and the Jews in the Northeast, major urban centers. They bring differing views and political ideas, some of which still influence public opinion today. And then the biggest secular difference, of course, is North versus South. Long-standing differences. The South still lags behind even today in support. This is in terms of polling and things like that, not on an individual basis, obviously, in terms of support for civil rights. And it continues to favor state power at the expense of national power. So small national government, local rule in terms of state power. The American West has often been seen as wild. Views, however, vary on that. Some anti-government, some people in the West are anti-government and want to live in more isolated areas, etc., while others want government involvement for solutions to big issues, including water rights. And then urban versus rural. Rural areas tend to be more conservative. Urban areas tend to be more liberal. And then finally, family and family size. Urbanization and birth control options decrease the large families otherwise necessary in the previous American agrarian, like farming culture society. Family sizes have gone down, and the traditional nuclear formations have decreased due to increased rates in divorce, as well as pregnancy and birth outside of marriage. Changes in the composition of households in terms of size, the number of single-parent homes, can affect the demands people place on the government. For instance, single parents might want the government subsidized daycare or after-school programs. So that's it for Chapter 1, Section 5. At this point, you should go to Google Classroom and answer the essential question, which was, how have the demographics of the United States changed, and what are the potential impacts of that change?